Pull your chair closer to the fire.
The Duke of Marchwood broke the wrong seal on his wedding morning, and by the time he understood, his bride was already in the carriage to St. Andrew's Church. Edmund Hartfield had risen before the household. The valet had laid out the wedding coat on a chair, the silver-grey waistcoat folded across its arm, the dark blue cravat pressed flat. But Edmund had passed all of it without touching, and walked instead to his study at the head of the south corridor, because there was a letter from his solicitor he had meant to read the night before. He would sign what needed signing before he was due in the breakfast room. He was 27 and a duke, and he believed, that morning, he understood what kind of marriage he was about to make. The study was cold. The fire had been laid but not lit. The housekeeper had not expected him to come down before the maid swept the grate. He crossed to the desk and saw, on the green leather blotter, the letter he had asked for, sealed with the dark red wax of Lansdowne and Holt, and beside it, fanned across the desk like a hand of cards laid down in haste, 3 other letters that had not been there the night before. The new valet, Tomlin, had been clearing out the late Mr. Greaves's effects. Greaves had been valet to Edmund's father for 31 years, and had passed in his sleep in the small attic room 3 weeks ago, and his desk had stood untouched until this morning, when Tomlin, eager to prove himself, terrified of the wedding, had dragged it from the wall and emptied its drawers onto the Duke's blotter without thought. Most of the papers were inventories. One was a faded receipt for boot blacking. One was a letter, addressed in a careful sailor's hand, sealed with cheap green wax, and wrapped in a strip of linen as if to keep it safe from rain. The cover was inscribed, "To Lady Cora Linwood, by hand, into her keeping only." Edmund did not, at first, read the cover. He saw the green wax, and the wrapping of linen, and the seal of an unfamiliar coat of arms, and assumed it was the second of the trust documents he had been promised, the one his solicitor had written to him about, that had gone missing in transit between Portsmouth and London some weeks ago, and had been declared lost. He picked it up. He broke the seal with his thumbnail. He unfolded the page. He read 3 lines, and stopped breathing. It was not a trust document. It was a letter to the woman he was marrying in 3 hours, and it was written by a man he had never heard of. And it began, "My lady, you do not know my name, but I have known yours since the autumn of 15, when you walked the wet quayside at Portsmouth in a dark cloak, and brought bread to the widow of the carpenter Calloway, and asked her not to speak of it." Edmund sat down, slowly, in the chair behind his desk. He had not meant to sit. His knees made the choice for him. He read the letter through once, and then again, and then a third time. The fire was unlit. The room was cold. The clock above the cabinet ticked the seconds towards 7, then past 7, then toward 8. He did not move. The letter was 4 pages long, written in the cramped, deliberate hand of a man unaccustomed to writing letters, but determined to be understood. It had been written 3 years past, the night before the Pellucid sailed for the Mediterranean, by Lieutenant James Carow. Edmund did not know the name. And yet by the second page, he understood that this letter had been written in the certainty that it would never be answered, and in the absolute conviction that the woman who would receive it had to be told, even if she chose to read it once and burn it without reply, what kind of person she was. The letter said this: "In the autumn of 1815, in the worst months of the famine, Lieutenant Carow had been ashore in Portsmouth on half pay, lodging above the bakery in Brockley Lane. His landlady, Mrs. Hyatt, had told him a young gentlewoman came at dusk 3 nights a week with a basket and left bread, tea wrapped in paper, and small coins twisted into knots of wool on the doorsteps of the carpenters, the coopers, and the boatswain's widow, and walked away without knocking. Mrs. Hyatt had not known her name, only that she came in a dark hooded cloak with a dark bronze trim, hair the colour of beechwood in October, and did not speak. Mrs. Hyatt had taken to leaving a candle in the window so she could find the steps in the fog, and the candle had become a private signal between 2 women who never exchanged a word. Lieutenant Carow had watched, from the upstairs window, on 3 of those evenings. He had not approached. He had told himself it would frighten her, that to offer a name would be to take from her the only freedom she had, to do good without being seen. He had let her go. He had rejoined his ship, sailed for Cadiz and Genoa and the long blockade, and he had not forgotten her. He had asked, in such ways as a sailor on half-pay can ask, who she was, and the answer had come back through 3 months of patient inquiry. Lady Cora Linwood, elder daughter of Captain Linwood of the Bellona, deceased. The Linwoods had no fortune. The widow had remarried a Mr. Halloran of Bath. The daughter lived chiefly with an aunt, and was rumored to be of a cold and proud disposition. Of a cold and proud disposition. Lieutenant Caro had laughed, the letter said, when he heard that. He had laughed alone in his cabin, with the lanterns swinging and the deck creaking, and he had thought of the bread and the wool-twisted coins and the candle in the bakery window, and he had wished, with the helpless clarity of a man who knows he will never have the chance, that he could write to her one day and tell her what he had seen, so that on whatever day she met the man she was meant to marry, she would not be obliged to pretend she had nothing to bring him but a name. He had written it in April, 3 years past, the night before the Pellucid sailed, sealed in green wax and wrapped in linen, sent by the hand of a fellow officer bound for London. The officer had given it to a porter at the receiving house in St. James's, who had given it to the wrong stable boy, who, startled by the name Linwood, had carried it to the side door of Marchwood House and put it into the hand of the late valet, Greaves. Greaves had set it on his desk in the attic, meaning to ask the Duke's father the next day who Lady Cora Linwood was. He had been 72 and forgetful, and by morning his master was confined to bed by his last illness. The letter had slipped beneath an inventory of plate and stayed there, undisturbed, for 3 years. Lieutenant Caro had been lost in October of the year following. The Pellucid had been wrecked off Cape Spartel in a winter gale. 8 officers and 41 ratings had been lost. The lieutenant's name had appeared in the casualty list in the Naval Chronicle, and Edmund could remember, vaguely, having read it. He had not connected it to anything in his life. He folded the letter at the long crease and pressed his palms flat upon it. The clock struck 8. From far down the corridor, he heard the housekeeper's voice carrying instructions to a maid, and the dogs in the yard answering one another, and somewhere upstairs, the soft, familiar sound of the new valet drawing the curtains in his bedroom, expecting to find him there. The wedding was at 11. The carriage was to be at the door at 9:30. He sat with his hand upon the letter and tried to remember the woman he had seen 3 times in the past 4 months, the woman he had described in his head, in the careful, dry vocabulary of a man making a contract, as cold and proud and self-contained. He could not remember her differently yet. He could only remember that he had been wrong. He had met her 3 times before this morning. The first had been at his uncle Lord Thurning's house in Berkeley Square, on the 2nd evening of February, when his uncle had brought the marriage proposal forward formally, and the families had been asked to dine. Edmund had arrived in time for the soup. Lady Cora had been seated 3 places to his left, between her stepfather Mr. Halloran and an aunt with a feathered turban, and she had not spoken to him during the soup, the fish, or the partridge. She had answered his stepfather's questions in 3-word sentences. She had refused the wine. She had eaten very little. When the ladies withdrew, she had risen and inclined her head to the table without meeting any face in particular, and Edmund had watched her go and thought, "She does not want this." He had been relieved. He had not wanted this either. The marriage was a piece of necessary repair work. His uncle's debts, the Linwood estate's reduced rents, the Halloran connection's wish to have a duchess in the family for purposes he had not asked about and did not want to know, and the willingness of both parties to perform the contract without sentiment had seemed, that night, the best part of the arrangement. The second beating had been 5 weeks later, at a charity concert at Argyle Rooms. Her stepfather had arranged the seating, so Edmund and Lady Cora sat side by side in the front row, the rest of the party shielding them from the room. Her gown had been a dull biscuit colour, her hair dressed without ornament, her gloves clean and well kept, and stretched at the seam, as if mended too many times. They had not spoken until the second piece. He had said, "I am told you do not care for the season." She had said, "I do not." He had said, "Nor I." She had said, Then perhaps that is one thing on which we are agreed. He had taken her answer for foi d'oeil, and had been, that night, almost satisfied. A wife who would not require sentimental attendance was a wife he could live beside without lying. The third meeting had been at the signing of the settlement, 10 days ago, in his solicitor's chambers in Lincoln's Inn. She had come accompanied by her aunt and by her stepfather. She had read every clause of the document twice, slowly, with her gloved finger moving along the line, a thing his uncle had remarked upon afterwards as evidence of an unbecoming legal interest in her own affairs. At the second clause, concerning the disposal of certain moneys left to her by her grandfather, she had stopped and read it again, and asked for a single change in the wording, that the trust be administered by herself jointly with the Duke, and not by her stepfather. Mr. Halloran had risen at this, and turned a colour that Edmund had not previously seen on a human face. The aunt had murmured. The solicitor had glanced at Edmund. Edmund, bored, indifferent, faintly amused by Mr. Halloran's distress, had said, "I see no objection." The clause had been redrawn. Mr. Halloran had not spoken to him again that morning. Lady Cora had thanked him with a small inclination of the head, and had not met his eyes when she did it. And Edmund had walked out into the spring afternoon with the impression of a woman who had defended herself competently against a small theft, and would now retreat back into the silence she preferred. That was the woman he had been about to marry at 11 o'clock. The woman in the letter on his desk was not that woman. Or rather, she was, but she had been so much more, all along, than the surface he had agreed to take. He thought of the dark cloak with the bronze trim. He thought of the candle in the bakery window. He thought of Mr. Halloran, the colour of his face when she had asked for the trust to pass to her own administration. He thought of her gloves, well-kept, mended, and of the small coins twisted into knots of wool, and he understood, all at once, where those small coins had come from. They had come from her own purse, from whatever her stepfather had not yet succeeded in taking. She had been feeding the widows of her father's seamen out of her own pin money during the famine, telling no one, on her stepfather spread in Bath drawing rooms, the phrase of a cold and proud disposition. He stood up. He set the letter carefully back upon the blotter, refolded along its original creases. He went to the bell and rang it once. Tomlin appeared in 12 seconds, breathless, terrified that he was late. "Where," Edmund said, in the quiet voice his servants had learned by now to fear more than shouting, "did this come from?" Tomlin looked at the letter. He looked at the Duke. He looked at the floor. From Mr. Greaves's desk, Your Grace. I was clearing it out. The lid drawer. There were 3 or 4 old papers in the back of the lid drawer. I did not look at them. I brought them down." "When was the desk last cleared?" "Never, Your Grace. Not since Mr. Greaves came to it." "And he came to it?" "In your father's time, Your Grace. 30-some years past." Edmund nodded. He turned the letter once on the blotter, so that the cover faced upward, and read the inscription again. "To Lady Cora Linwood, by hand, into her keeping only." He had broken the seal of a private letter intended for the woman he was about to marry. By any code of honour he understood, the correct thing was to confess it to her at the first private moment after the ceremony, return the letter into her hand, and bear whatever judgment she chose to pass. He did not yet know what kind of judgment that would be. He suspected he would deserve it. "Your Grace," Tomlin said carefully. "The carriage is ordered for the half-hour." "Yes." "The bishop is at the church already. Your uncle has gone ahead." "Yes." "Will you come up to dress, Your Grace?" Edmund looked at the cold grate, at the letter, at the small green seal lying broken on the blotter beside it. He thought, "I am about to marry her in a public ceremony before 200 people, and I have just learned, in the space of 15 minutes, that I have spent 4 months understanding her wrongly. I cannot enter the church carrying that error. I cannot stand at the altar believing what I believed an hour ago. The vow I am about to make is to a woman I did not even know I was meeting. I must, at minimum, make the vow with the eyes of a man who has read this page." "Yes," he said. "Lay out the coat." He folded the letter again, more carefully this time. He slid it into the inside pocket of the wedding coat, where the prayer book was meant to go. He carried the prayer book in his outer pocket instead. He went up to dress. Down in the great hall of Marchwood House, the long case clock struck the 8:15. In a smaller house, on the other side of London, in a bedroom whose window faced the garden, Lady Cora Linwood sat at her dressing table with her hands folded in her lap and watched her aunt fasten the last small pearl into her hair, and thought of nothing in particular, except the colour of the morning light and the strange, hollow quiet that had settled in her chest when she had woken before dawn and remembered what day it was. She was 25, going to be married at 11 o'clock to a man she had spoken with for less than half an hour in total, in 3 rooms, 3 times. She had agreed because the alternative was to remain in her stepfather's house and watch him work his way, by patient quarterly raid, through the trust her grandfather had left. She had agreed because the Duke was reputed honest and quiet, and the settlement gave her the right to administer her own trust jointly with him. She had told herself, lying in her narrow bed the night before, that this was as much as she could ask of the world, and that at the altar she would not look across at her stepfather or up into the gallery, only at the bishop's hands, old and gentle, which would do their work and be done. She was not afraid of the Duke. She was not in love with him. She did not yet know him. What she was that morning, although she would not have used the word even in the privacy of her own thinking, was a woman preparing to give up a name she had carried for 25 years, and to enter, with her own hand and her own voice, a new life whose furnishings she could not yet picture. Her aunt finished with the pearl. Her aunt stood back. Her aunt said, with the brisk practicality that was the only kindness she had ever managed to express, "There, you are very fine." Cora rose. She turned to the long mirror. She saw a tall, slender woman in a high-waisted gown of ivory silk, over an underdress of pale amber, with the dark bronze travelling cloak waiting on the chair behind her, folded, ready. The cloak she would wear out of the church and into the carriage. The cloak she had had remade 3 times in the last decade. The cloak she had walked the Portsmouth quayside in the autumn of 15, with a basket on her arm. She touched, without thinking, the smooth inside of her left wrist, where for the first 10 years of her life she had worn a small braided bracelet of dark sailor's twine, given to her by her father one September before he sailed. The bracelet had broken when she was 10, and she had folded the strands away in a drawer, but her fingers still went, in moments of quiet, to the place where it had been. Today, of all days, they went there now. Her aunt said, "The carriage is at the door." Cora said, "Yes." She picked up the prayer book her father had left her, small, leather, the pages thumbed soft, and walked down the stairs. The carriage was indeed at the door. Her stepfather was already inside it, waiting in the seat opposite hers, with his cane laid across his knees and a small smile on his mouth that she did not like and did not respond to. The carriage rolled into the spring morning. The streets were quiet. The bells of St. Andrew's would not begin until 10. She did not know, could not know, that the man she was riding to meet had spent the last 40 minutes reading a letter about a candle in a bakery window, and was, at this moment, descending the stairs of Marchwood House with that letter folded against his ribs, and was about to look at her across an aisle of stone and white lilies in a way no one had ever yet looked at her in her life. The church of St. Andrew stood at the south end of a small square that had been swept that morning by 2 old men with broad brooms. Lilies had been brought in from a glasshouse in Kew before dawn. Their stems had been wound to the iron of the railings and to the head of every pew, and the air inside the nave smelled green and faintly bitter, like cut stalk and water. 200 candles had been lit. The light fell along the floor in pale lengths and reached almost to the chancel step. Edmund stood at the foot of the chancel with the bishop on his right hand and his uncle, Lord Thurning, on his left, and felt the letter against his ribs as a small, dense weight that did not move when he breathed. He had not greeted the gallery. He had not looked at his uncle. He had looked once, briefly, at the 2 stone figures on their tomb above the side aisle, a knight and his lady, hands folded in carved repose, and had thought that the 2 of them, after 800 years, looked more like married people than anyone he had ever met. The bells began. From outside the south door, a murmur ran along the gathered guests, and the verger pulled the door open, and there was a small ripple of motion in the front pew, where her stepfather rose to take his place at the head of the aisle, and Edmund turned, as the order of service required, to face the door. He saw her come in. She wore the ivory silk and the pale amber underdress, and the dark bronze cloak across her shoulders had been undone, and was being lifted away by a verger as she crossed the threshold. Her hair was the colour of beechwood in October, dressed plainly, and bound with a single thin coil of pearls. She was tall. He had not, before, thought of her as tall, and she walked with the small, precise carriage of a woman who has been told from childhood not to take up more space than she had been allotted. Her gloves were the same gloves he had seen at the settlement. The seam at the right wrist had been mended again. He saw it. He understood, this morning, what it meant. She did not look at him until she was within 10 paces of the altar, and when at last she did look at him, once, briefly, as the bishop had directed, he was looking at her in a way he had not yet looked at her in any of the 3 rooms in which they had previously met. He did not smile. He did not soften his face. He did not perform any of the wedding day expressions a duke is expected to perform. He simply met her eyes, and held them, and did not look away. There was nothing in his face that was froideur. There was nothing in it that was pity. There was, in his face, something she had no name for, an attention so steady and so careful that for an instant she thought he might be about to speak. She faltered for half a step. Her hand tightened on her father's prayer book. Her stepfather, beside her, mistook the falter for sentimental nerves and patted her elbow with the satisfaction she had no time, just then, to resent. She reached the altar. She took her place at Edmund's side. The bishop opened the book. The service began as such services did, and Edmund heard none of it. He heard the sound of his own pulse in his ears, and the rasp of the prayer book pages, and the distant cough of an old gentleman in the third pew. He saw, beside him, the small stillness of a woman who was holding herself upright with a discipline he had previously read as coldness, and now understood as the only armour she had ever been allowed. He thought of the bakery window and the candle in it. He thought of Mrs. Hyatt, whom he had never met, leaving a single candle for a young woman she had never spoken to, so that she could find the doorsteps in the fog. He thought, with a sudden ache low under his collarbone, that no one had ever lit a candle in any window for him in his life. The bishop read the dearly beloved. The bishop read the marriage charges. The bishop turned the page and prepared to put to the assembled congregation the formal question of impediment. It was at this moment, in the small breathing space between the bishop's first inhalation and his first word, that Mr. Halloran rose from the front pew and stepped one careful pace into the aisle. There was a hiss of breath through the church. Mr. Halloran was a man of 54, well-dressed, with thin, light hair, and a complexion that pinkened at the cheekbones when he was about to take pleasure in a public scene. He wore a black coat and a dove waistcoat, and a small chain of office which he held no right to wear. He inclined his head to the bishop, as if entering a board meeting, and said, in a voice pitched to carry to the rear of the gallery, "Your Reverence, I beg the indulgence of the assembled. There is, I am sorry to say, an impediment." The bishop, who had not been a young man for 30 years, and had been bishop of this diocese for 19 of them, turned his head slowly and looked at Mr. Halloran with an expression which suggested that his patience was a finite resource and was being spent at this moment. "Mr. Halloran," the bishop said, "is this a matter of canon?" "It is a matter of conduct, Your Reverence." A faint sound rose at the back of the church, a stifled gasp, followed by the squeak of a pew board as several elderly ladies turned in their seats to see better. Edmund did not turn. Cora did not turn. Edmund looked instead at her, at the side of her face which had gone quite still, the way the surface of deep water goes still over an undertow. Her gloved hand, on the prayer book, did not move, but her thumb pressed, slowly and deliberately, against the leather binding, and pressed, and pressed. and only when her thumb was white did she set the book down on the prayer rail in front of her and lift her face. She did not look at her stepfather. She looked at Edmund. It was the second time she had looked at him with her own face, not the face she had shown at dinner, or at the concert, or in his solicitor's chambers. It was a face he had not seen before. There was in it an enormous tiredness. There was in it a kind of weary, almost bored apology, as if she were apologizing in advance for the indignity that was about to be inflicted upon him on her account, and as if she had been apologizing for indignities all her life, and was very practiced at it. He did not return the look with sympathy. He returned it with the same flat, steady attention with which he had met her at the door of the church, and he gave, very slightly, a single short shake of his head, the smallest possible signal, and turned then to Mr. Halloran, and said, in the level, almost mild tone of a man who has decided in the last 15 minutes that there is exactly one thing he will not allow to happen in his lifetime. Mr. Halloran, state it. Mr. Halloran appeared not to have expected to be addressed by the Duke. He opened his mouth. He shut it. He opened it again. Your Grace, I had hoped to be heard by His Reverence in the proper— State it. We are short of time. It is, Your Grace, I am sorry to say, there is a question of long standing concerning my stepdaughter's conduct in the autumn and winter of 15, when she resided briefly at my late wife's house at Linwood Cross, and which conduct, were it to come to wider public knowledge, would render her, in my view— he turned his face piously to the bishop, and I trust in His Reverence's view also— unfit to enter into the present sacrament without further inquiry. He paused. He had clearly rehearsed. It is, he said carefully, the matter of certain irregular evening absences from my wife's house, in the company of a person whom my stepdaughter has never seen fit to name, and which absences, were they to be reviewed by, say, the trustees of the small marriage portion which my late wife laid down on her— You will say no more, Edmund said. He said it quietly. He did not raise his voice. The bishop had already lifted a hand to silence Mr. Halloran. The bishop's hand was now no longer needed. Edmund turned to the bishop. Your Reverence, with your permission, the gentleman has raised a matter of conduct. He claims, before this congregation, that the lady at my side absented herself from her stepfather's house in the autumn and winter of 15, in the company of an unnamed person, and that this is a matter requiring inquiry. I will satisfy the inquiry now, and we will then proceed. The bishop, who had married 3 generations of Hartfields and considered no Hartfield easily ruffled, inclined his head. Proceed, Your Grace. Edmund did not, at this point, take the letter from his coat. He had no intention of reading aloud, in a church full of curious faces, a private testimony of a lost lieutenant's affection, a private testimony that, by every right, belonged in the hands of the woman beside him, before it belonged in any other hands. But he had intended, since the moment he understood what Mr. Halloran was about to attempt, to use the existence of the letter without reading its contents. He turned to face the congregation. He did not raise his voice. In the autumn and winter of 15, he said, my wife, as she will be when this gentleman has stepped back into his pew, went on 3 evenings each week in a dark cloak to the houses of 3 widows in Portsmouth, the widow of the carpenter Calloway, the widow of the cooper Whitfield, and the widow of the boatswain Reed. The widows' husbands had served under her father, the late Captain Linwood of the Bellona, and had been lost with him at the Glorious First. He drew a slow breath. The candle nearest him guttered once and steadied. She brought them bread, tea, and small coins. She knocked on no door and left her name at none. Her landlady, Mrs. Hyatt of Brockley Lane, will testify to the cloak, the basket, and the candle left in the window so the lady might find the steps in the fog. Lieutenant James Carow, of His Majesty's ship Pellucid, who lodged above the bakery, observed her on 3 evenings and made the inquiries which produced her name. Lieutenant Carow is no longer with us. He left, before sailing, an account of what he had seen. I have it in my pocket. I will produce it before any magistrate, any trustee, and any court of inquiry this gentleman cares to convene. Are there other questions of conduct, Mr. Halloran, you wish to put before this congregation?" The silence in the church had the texture of held breath.
Edmund did not turn his head, but he could feel, with the precision of a man who has just spoken without having known 10 minutes earlier that he was going to speak, that the woman beside him had not moved. Her gloved hand had risen, very slowly, and pressed once, and only once, against her own breastbone, as if to press something back. Mr. Halloran's pink had drained out of his cheekbones. He was looking at the Duke as if he had not, until this moment, properly understood that the Duke was a person who could speak. "Your Grace." "Step back into your pew, Mr. Halloran. There are documents. The trust." "Step back into your pew. We will speak of the trust on Monday in my solicitor's chambers, with such documents as you are able to produce. We will not speak of it now." Mr. Halloran stepped back into his pew. He did not sit so much as fold. The pew creaked under him. The lady on his far side, an aunt with a feathered turban, moved 1/2 inch away from him. The bishop turned his page. The bishop said, "Then, by the grace of God, we shall proceed." The service resumed. Edmund did not, even now, look at Cora. He had decided that he would not, until the moment the bishop required it. He had decided that whatever passed between them after this morning would have to pass with the letter in her hands and his own confession in her ears, and that until that confession had been made, he would not presume the small currency of a glance. The bishop reached the vows. It was Edmund who spoke first, by the order of service. He spoke clearly. He spoke without ornament. He said his name and the form of the words. "I, Edmund Marchwood, take thee, Cora Linwood, to be my wedded wife." He paused, not for sentiment, but because the breath caught, and went on. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." He kept his voice low. He did not turn it into a performance. The phrase, "to love and to cherish," came out of his mouth with the carefulness of a man who has just realized, that morning, that he has agreed to something larger than he believed he had agreed to. Cora's voice, when she answered, was lower than he had expected. It was a deeper voice than the small, precise voice he had heard in the solicitor's chambers. A voice that came from further down in the chest. The voice of a woman accustomed to being heard above wind. She said her name. She said the form of the words. She did not falter at the line about love and cherish. She said it with the same level, even gravity with which she had said the line about sickness and health. And Edmund understood that she had decided, at some time in the past hour, what manner of vow she meant to make, and had not deviated from it on the strength of one strange look across an aisle. The bishop joined their hands. The ring went on. The bishop said the blessing. It was done. The congregation breathed. There was a small communal sound at the back of the church, a sound like a long-held question being released, and then the soft rustle of people preparing to rise. The verger drew the bell. The bells of St. Andrew's began. The newly married pair turned, by the order of service, and walked down the aisle together at the bishop's signal. And Edmund, for the first time since he had broken the seal of the letter at 7:30 that morning, looked at his wife. She was looking straight ahead. Her face was composed. Her cheeks, however, were faintly colored for the first time he had ever seen, and her gloved fingers, where they rested in the crook of his arm, were trembling, very slightly, in a way which had nothing to do with the cold. He did not say anything. There was nothing he could say in a church full of 200 curious faces. He laid his other hand over her gloved fingers, briefly, where they rested on his sleeve. Only a moment. Only enough for her to feel the steadiness of it through the silk. And she did not look at him, but she did not move her hand away. They reached the south door. The morning light fell on them. The bells were loud in the open air. The carriage was already at the foot of the steps, the 4 greys steaming. They went down the steps together. They were married.
Mr. Halloran did not come out of the church. In the carriage, Edmund handed her up first. The footman shut the door. The carriage moved. They were alone, for the first time in their lives, in a small, enclosed space, and the silence between them lasted from the gate of the churchyard to the corner of Marylebone Lane. She was looking out of the window. She had not yet drawn off her gloves. Her hands were in her lap, one inside the other, the way her aunt had taught her to hold them when she was a girl. He sat opposite her. He had taken off his hat. He looked at her, and he discovered, with the small jolt of surprise that goes with seeing, at last, what one has been failing to see, that her eyes, in the slant of the morning light through the carriage glass, were not the dark eyes he had taken them to be at the dinner table. They were grey. They were the grey of weather over the Solent. He had, it seemed, never properly looked at her face before today. She turned her head from the window. She met his gaze. She said, "I do not know how you knew." He said, "I did not, until an hour ago." He did not yet take the letter from his coat. He could not, in a moving carriage on Marylebone Lane, with a wedding breakfast for 60 waiting at Marchwood House, hand her a letter from a deceased man and ask her to read it. He could only, having waited in the church until he had stood beside her in the vow, meet her grey eyes now and say, "There is a thing I must give you, when we are at home and we are alone. You will be very angry with me when I give it to you. I have done a thing this morning that you have every right to find unforgivable. But, first, before I give you the thing, before you read it and decide what to do, I wish to say, here, in this carriage, in case I do not have the chance later, I had not understood until an hour ago what kind of woman I was marrying. Forgive me for not having understood it sooner. I was prepared to be a fair husband to a stranger. I would like to be a different husband to you. I do not yet know how. I am asking your patience while I find out." She did not speak. Her lips parted and shut. She looked down at her gloved hands. After a moment she said, very quietly, "I do not know what to say to that." "You do not have to say anything to that." I had decided I would say very little to you today. I had thought it would be easier for both of us." "Yes." "You have made it very difficult." "I am sorry." She looked up at him then. The corner of her mouth lifted, briefly. Not a smile, only the readiness of one. "I do not believe you are, Your Grace." "No," he said. "I am not." The carriage turned into Cavendish Square. She drew off one of her gloves slowly, finger by finger. He saw, when the glove was gone, the place inside her left wrist where her fingers went at moments of quiet. He did not, yet, ask about it. He had used up, for the morning, every confession he was permitted to make. Marchwood House had been opened from cellar to garret 3 days before. The east salon had been swept and aired and dressed with white roses. The long table had been laid for 60 along its length. 6 liveried footmen stood at attention along the north wall, and at the south end, the fire, large, old, a fire that had been kept burning, in winter and summer alike, since the second Duke's time, gave out its steady, deep red heat. The household had been told that the Duke and Duchess would be received at the foot of the great stair. The household had been told to greet the new mistress with the formal courtesy due to her station, and not, under any circumstance, with the curiosity due to a stranger. The household, when the carriage drew up, had not been told what had happened in the church. Word would arrive within the hour, brought by a footman who had stood at the south door of St. Andrew's. Word would travel along the back stairs from the kitchen to the housekeeper to the upper chambers in 15 minutes by the back stairs and 40 by the front, and by tea-time every soul under the roof would know that the new Duchess had been challenged by her stepfather at the altar, and that the Duke had silenced him with 3 sentences and a letter from a sailor who was no longer alive. Cora came up the steps on Edmund's arm. She did not falter. She had taken half a minute in the carriage to draw the glove back over her bare wrist, and another half-minute to compose her face into the expression which had served her since 15, pleasant, attentive, unreadable, and she carried it now along the long red runner from the front door to the foot of the stair. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pell, stood there in her dark grey gown and white linen cap, and inclined her head with grave correctness. Cora returned the inclination. Mrs. Pell led her along the south corridor toward the salon. Edmund went up 2 steps with his butler to receive a pair of telegrams, and then followed. The breakfast began. Cora was placed at the head of the table, Edmund at the foot. The bishop sat at her right, his uncle Lord Thurning at her left. The aunt in the feathered turban sat at Edmund's right, her husband at his left. The conversation was decorous, the food eaten, the champagne poured. No one spoke of Mr. Halloran's interruption, but the table conspired to talk gently of small matters: an actress engaged at Drury Lane, the spring race, a May frost. Cora answered when addressed. She did not initiate. Her colour, by the second course, had returned almost to ivory. Edmund watched her without watching, the trick being to keep one's eyes on the bishop while remaining aware of the woman 60 feet away. It was Mr. Petherton of the aunt's table who eventually leaned slightly toward Edmund and said, in a voice meant only for Edmund's ear, "Your Grace, you spoke to that man with great steadiness in the church. Was the letter as you described it?" "It was, sir. Forgive me, it is not my business, but you read it this morning. Within the hour. The lady does not know its existence." Edmund met the elderly man's mild, attentive gaze. Mr. Petherton was, he understood, a kindly old gentleman of enormous discretion, who had married a foolish woman, and had, over 40 years, perfected the art of asking the only honest question in a room, and asking it so quietly that no one else heard. "She does not, sir." "Then forgive me. I would not be the man you are this afternoon, Your Grace, for any title in England. Whatever passes between you and her tonight, I wish you both a great deal of luck." Edmund said, "Thank you, sir." Mr. Petherton inclined his head and turned back to the duck on his plate. The breakfast wound on. The toasts were made. The bishop spoke briefly. Lord Thurning spoke at greater length, and worse. The bride was not required to speak. At 1:45, the table cleared, the older guests already withdrawing. Cora rose on the housekeeper's signal, and was led from the salon by Mrs. Pell, with the aunt and 2 cousins as a small escort, toward the suite of rooms which had been her mother-in-law's, and which had been opened, aired, and prepared for her. Edmund was kept downstairs another half-hour. He stood by the long window of the south salon, and shook hands with the elderly cousins of his late mother, and said the polite things that were required, and his eyes, while he said them, were on the door of the south corridor, and his hand, where it rested in the pocket of his coat, was on the folded letter against his ribs. At 3 o'clock, the last of the guests went out into the spring afternoon, and the door of Marchwood House was closed. Edmund went up to his dressing room, dismissed Tomlin with a single nod, and stood for 1 minute alone in front of the long glass, looking at the man he had become at 7:30 that morning. The man in the glass looked very much like the man who had stood there yesterday. The eyes were perhaps a little darker. The mouth was perhaps a little tighter. He recognized himself with the small surprise of a man who had expected, somehow, to look different. He went out of the dressing room and along the corridor and tapped, very lightly, on the door of the Duchess's sitting room. Mrs. Pell opened it. The aunt was being shown out at the inner door. Cora was at the long window, her back to the room, her bronze cloak removed and laid across the back of a chair, the ivory gown still on, the pearls still in her hair. She did not turn when the Duke entered. She turned only when Mrs. Pell had gone and the door had been closed, and she had heard, behind her, the small distinct sound of his boot heel on the polished oak floor. She turned and looked at him. She said, "You wished to give me something, Your Grace." "I did." "Then please give it me. I have been waiting since the carriage." He crossed to her. He did not, at the last moment, hesitate. He took the folded letter from inside his coat and held it out to her on the flat of his hand. The cover, with its careful sailor's inscription, was upward. The broken green seal lay along the fold. He said, "I broke this seal at 7:30 this morning, in my study downstairs. I broke it without reading the cover. I believed it to be a trust document I was expecting from my solicitor. I read 4 pages before I understood what it was. By the time I understood, I had read it. I cannot give it to you with the seal whole. I can only give it to you with my apology, and my testimony that I have spoken of its contents to no one but you, and to Mr. Halloran in church, and that the church will hear of it only what was said there. The rest is between you and the man who wrote it. I am very sorry. She did not, at first, take the letter from his hand. She looked at it. She looked at him. Her face had not changed. She said, "From whom is this letter?" "From a Lieutenant James Carrow, of the late Pelicid." She did not move. He had thought, perhaps, that she might gasp, that her hand might rise to her mouth, that her face might break. None of these things happened. Her grey eyes went very still, the way still water goes still over depth, and a very small line appeared between her dark brows. And after a long, quiet moment, she said, in a voice that was lower than the voice she had used in the church, "Lieutenant Carrow is... I knew the name." "You knew him?" I never met him. I had heard that there was a young officer in lodgings above Mrs. Hyatt's bakery in 15, and that he had asked her, one morning, one of the children of the carpenter Calloway told me, 2 years afterwards, that he had inquired after a young woman in a cloak. I never knew his name. You knew of him? In an indirect way, yes. Mrs. Hyatt did not tell you? Mrs. Hyatt did not know my name. We never spoke. There was a candle in her window on certain nights. There was always a candle. I assumed it was hers. I went away from Portsmouth in the spring of 16, and I did not return, and I never saw her again. He wrote to you in April of that year, before sailing for Cadiz. He wrote 4 pages. The letter went astray in the receiving house in St. James's. The wrong stable boy carried it to the wrong house. It was placed on the desk of an old valet of my father's who is no longer with us. It lay in the drawer of his desk for 3 years. It was found this morning by the new valet, in the course of clearing out the desk, and put on my blotter at 7:15. I broke the seal at 7:30. I read it 3 times. He was lost at Cape Spartel in the autumn of 16. He never knew that the letter had not reached you. She had not, in this entire account, taken the letter. She had not moved. He saw now the smallest tremor at the corner of her mouth, not in her eyes, only in the corner of her mouth. He set the letter, very carefully, on the small table beside her, between an unlit candle and a porcelain tray that held a single dried rose. He stepped back. He said, "Read it or do not read it. Burn it or do not burn it. I have given you all of it that I am able to give. If you wish me to leave the room, I shall leave the room. If you wish me to wait outside the door, I shall wait outside the door. If you wish me never to speak of it again, I shall never speak of it again. If you wish to speak of it, I shall hear you. Whatever you decide is what we shall do." She did not, even now, look down at the letter. She looked at him. Her grey eyes were wet, very slightly, along the lower lashes. She had not yet allowed the wetness to gather into a tear. She said, quietly. She told him he had not had to tell her he had broken the seal. He answered that yes, he had had to. Many men would not have, she said quietly. He was not many men, he said. He was the man she had married that morning. She allowed, with a small, dry tilt of the head, that this was a thing he had only been since 11 o'clock. And before 11 o'clock, she pressed. Before 11 o'clock, he said, I was a man who had not known what kind of woman he was marrying. Now I do. I am very sorry I did not know sooner. I am very sorry I had to be told by a letter from a man I never met. She turned her head slightly. She looked at the unlit candle on the small table beside her. She said, "Will you light that candle, please?" He went to the bell. He did not ring it. He had a flint in his coat pocket, as men of the period carried, and he struck it on the small steel from the case, and he lit a taper at the spark, and he lit the candle from the taper, and the flame caught and stood up steady. He set the taper down. He stepped back. She looked at the candle for some seconds. Then she looked at the letter beside the candle. Then, slowly, in the way one approaches a thing that may yet bite, she lifted the letter into her hand. She did not read it standing up. She crossed to the chair at the long window and sat down with the letter on her lap, and she lifted the first page in her two ungloved hands, and she began to read. Edmund did not leave the room. He did not approach. He stood, instead, at the center of the carpet, with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, and he watched her face for the time it took her to read the 4 pages. And he did not look away. He saw, in the first page, her color go. He saw, in the second page, the small line between her brows deepen, and then, abruptly, smooth. He saw, in the third page, her left hand come up, without thought, without volition, and press, gently and for a long time, against the inside of her left wrist, where the little braid of dark sailor's twine had been, 25 years ago, before her father had drowned. He saw, in the fourth page, the first tear. She did not cry openly. She read the page through, slowly, and folded it along its long crease, and folded the others against it, and laid the letter in her lap, and pressed both hands flat upon it, and only then did she allow herself to bow her head by perhaps 3 inches, and let the tears fall, quiet, unstopped, the kind a person sheds for a thing she had not known she was permitted to grieve. He crossed to her. He did not touch her. He went down on one knee beside the chair, so that his face was below the level of hers, and he put his hand, palm up, careful, not asking, on the arm of the chair beside her hand. She did not, immediately, take it. She lifted her chin and turned her face to him, and let him see that she had been crying. She did not wipe the tears. She said, in the lower voice he had heard at the altar, "You are kneeling, Your Grace." "Yes." "On the wrong side of the room." "Where would you have me kneel?" She considered this. Then she lifted her right hand from the letter on her lap and put it, deliberately, on top of his upturned palm, and curled her fingers down around the side of his hand. Her hand was cold. Her hand was small, smaller than he had thought it was. Her grip, when he turned his fingers up to meet hers, was steady. "Here," she said. He stayed kneeling beside her for a long time. Neither of them spoke. The candle on the small table burned steadily. The ivory silk of her gown lay quiet against her knee. Outside, in Cavendish Square, the light shifted a long degree as the afternoon wore on. After perhaps a quarter of an hour, she drew a slow breath and said, "Will you tell me about him?" He told her what the letter said, in the order in which the letter said it. He did not paraphrase. He did not gild. He told her of Mrs. Hyatt and the candle in the bakery window. He told her of the inquiries made through 3 months of patient asking. He told her of the wreck off Cape Spartel. When he had finished, she did not speak for some time. She held the letter in her lap, the 4 folded pages, with the broken green seal lying on top, and she looked at the candle on the small table, as if testing whether the candle could bear what she was about to ask of it. She told him, in a voice so low he had to lean toward her to hear, that she had never known the lieutenant had existed. Edmund answered, simply, that the man had not expected an answer, that the letter was very clear on that point, that he had written it so that one day, in the future, she would know what he had seen. She considered that for a long moment, looking at the candle. It was kind of him, she said. It would have been easier on him to write nothing. He wrote a great deal. Edmund did not contradict any of these observations. He let them stand between them, like the small, steady candle on the small table. She closed her eyes. She did not, this time, weep. She set her hand on the folded pages on her lap and pressed them, very lightly, in the way one might press a hand on a child's forehead to test for fever. She said, "I will keep this. I do not mean to read it again today, but I will keep it. And I will write to Mrs. Hyatt, if she is still living. I will,
when this is over. I will go down to Portsmouth, and I will sit with her. I will go with you, if you will permit it. Yes, she said very quietly. Yes. Go with me. She opened her eyes. She looked at him then, in the slow, steady way of a woman who has just decided to see a man for the first time. She said, I have not, until today, looked at you. I have looked past your shoulder, and at the table, and at the orchestra, and at the page in the solicitor's chambers. I am very sorry. I had decided, on the second evening at your uncle's house, that you were the kind of man it was easier not to look at, because looking would mean hoping, and I had decided not to hope from you. What kind of man? A proud man. An indifferent man. A man who would meet me at the church and would not have wished, for either of us, that the marriage be more than a contract. I had told myself I had been very lucky. I had told myself that an indifferent husband was the best a woman in my circumstance could ask for, and that I should not be greedy. And now? She did not immediately answer. She tilted her head. She looked at him a long moment. She said, And now I think that I have. I have been wrong, more than once, in the last 6 weeks. I had thought you indifferent. I had thought myself prepared. I had thought I knew what I was walking into the church to do. I was wrong on all 3 counts. As was I. As were you. It seems, he said, we have begun by being wrong about each other. Perhaps it is the easiest place to start. She gave him then the first true smile he had ever seen on her face. It was a small smile. It did not show her teeth. It changed everything about her face. He had been looking, for half the day, at a steady, controlled face, which had bestowed upon the world the polite discipline of a woman who expected nothing back. The smile he saw now was the face beneath that face, the face she had not, in his presence, allowed before. She said, Stand up, Your Grace. Your knee will be stiff in the morning. It will be very stiff in the morning. That is no good, when we shall be having Mr. Halloran on Monday. No. And before Monday? Yes. Before Monday, Your Grace, I should like, if you will, to ride out tomorrow morning. I have not been on a horse in 9 months. There is a chestnut mare in your stable I saw from the window when the carriage came in. I would like to take her out at sunrise. With you, if you will come. Without you, if you will not. I will come. Good. Cora. It was the first time he had used her name without the title. He had not planned to. He had said it, and now it sat in the small space between them with the weight of an object placed on a table. She did not, this time, look away. She said, Yes. I should like, in time, for you to use my name. In time? Yes. I shall try, Your Grace. I cannot promise I shall manage it before Monday. It does not have to be before Monday. No. But by the autumn, perhaps. By the autumn, she said. I think you will hear it more than once. He stood up. His knee was indeed stiff. He bowed to her, formally, the way a duke bows to his duchess in their own house, not the bow of a courtier, but the small, private bow of a husband who has elected, of his own will, the gesture of respect. And he turned, and he went out of the room, and he closed the door very quietly behind him, and he stood for 1 long minute on the other side of the door, with his hand against the panel, and he listened, and he heard her, on the other side of the door, draw 1 long, slow breath that was almost laughter. The next morning at sunrise, the chestnut mare went out of the stable yard at Marchwood House at a quiet trot, with a pale grey gelding alongside her. The Duke and his new Duchess rode in the long park north of the house, where the chestnut avenue had not yet fully come into leaf, and the grass under the hooves was wet to the knee. They did not speak for the first 10 minutes. They did not have to. When at last they slowed at the river gate, she turned in the saddle and looked at him. Her hair, freed from the coil of pearls that had been in it the day before,
fell along her shoulder in a loose plait the colour of beechwood. Her cloak was the dark bronze cloak. Her gloves were her own old gloves, mended. She said, "I have not ridden out at this hour since I was a girl at Linwood Cross." "Then we shall ride out at this hour every day this week," he said, "until you are tired of it." "I shall not be tired of it." "Then every day this month." "That, Your Grace," she said, "is rash. We have an estate in Hertfordshire which I am told you do not visit. I expect to be persuaded to visit it. The riding there will be different." "I shall persuade you cheerfully. I have not been to Hertfordshire in 4 years." "Your housekeeper there will be very surprised." "My housekeeper there will be very pleased. She has, I'm told, been waiting for me to find a wife." "Has she?" "She is not the only one." The chestnut mare put her ears back at a heron at the edge of the river. The gelding turned in a half-circle, and Edmund settled him with a hand on his neck. Cora watched the heron go up out of the reeds, the slow, heavy beat of its wings, the small slap of water as its feet left the surface, and Edmund watched her watching the heron, and thought that, in the days to come, he would learn the geography of her face in the way one learned the geography of a county one had inherited and never properly visited, slowly, without map, on horseback. They rode back to the house at 7:30. Mrs. Pell met them at the side door with the air of a woman who had bad news to deliver and intended to deliver it in the order in which it had arrived. "Your Grace, a messenger came at 6, from Mr. Halloran's solicitor." "Already?" "It is a—" Mrs. Pell hesitated, then went on with the careful precision she had cultivated over 30 years. "It is a notice of petition, Your Grace. I had it brought to your study. I have not opened it." Cora went very still. Edmund laid his hand over hers briefly on the rein. He said, "Thank you, Mrs. Pell. We shall come down to the study in 20 minutes. In the study, an hour later, Edmund and Cora stood on either side of the green leather desk, where the letter from Lieutenant Carrow had been read at 7:30 the morning before. The letter from Mr. Halloran's solicitor lay open between them. It was 3 pages long. It was written in the heavy, sloping hand of a clerk who had been awake half the night. The petition asked the Court of Chancery to remove the late Linwood Trust, the small fund left by Cora's grandfather, which had been drawn into the marriage settlement under the new clause she had insisted upon 10 days ago, from her administration on grounds, listed at length, that her conduct in the autumn and winter of 15 had been of a nature inconsistent with the discreet management of property, and demonstrated, Mr. Halloran's solicitor wrote with considerable rhetorical flourish, a habit of clandestine disbursement of funds without record, oversight, or family approval, suggestive of an unsuitable disposition for the office of trustee. Cora read the petition through. She read it a second time. She set the page down on the desk and pressed her palms flat upon it. Her face had returned, by the second reading, to the steady, controlled mask she had worn at the dinner table on the second evening of February. She observed, levelly, that her stepfather had not given up. He had only changed instrument. He could not have the marriage, so he meant to have the trust. Edmund nodded once. He had never wanted the marriage, she said. He had wanted the trust through it. He had assumed, when he negotiated the contract, that she should never ask for the joint clause. When she had asked for it 10 days ago, he had understood, at the solicitor's table, that he had lost it. This petition was not new. It had been prepared the next morning. It had only been waiting for a pretext, and the pretext was the autumn of 15. Edmund replied that the autumn of 15, as they now knew it, was more honourable than anything Mr. Halloran had done in his life. She glanced at him, with a small, dry humour she had not, before, allowed her face. "Be careful, Your Grace. That is unmarried uncle talk. We are too newly married to talk that way of a member of the family." "Then I shall talk that way of him in private." "In private, Your Grace. Between you and me. In this room. He is the worst man I have met in 5 years." "In private," she said. "I agree with you." She turned the petition. She read again the list of grounds. She put her finger on a sentence and held it there, and looked up at him. "Edmund," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. She said it the way one tries the weight of a coin one has not, before, held, turning it slightly, weighing it on the palm. He did not, in answer, do what he wished to do, which was to come round the desk and take her hand. He stayed where he was. He inclined his head. "Cora," he answered, in a tone that gave her the answer to whatever question she had not yet asked. She went on, with the small line between her brows reappearing. "This petition. It has been prepared with care. The wording is precise. A clerk has been at it overnight. That is not a clerk who was hired this morning. He has had this drawn up for some time. It will not collapse merely because we go before the court and you tell them what you told the bishop. There are men on the bench who will require—" She paused and chose the word demonstration, of habit, of consistent moral character, of evidence broader than the testimony of a sailor who is no longer alive. "You have an idea." "I have an idea. It is not without cost to me. It will require me to do in public what I have spent a decade making sure no one would ever know I had done in private. I do not relish the prospect, but I think it is the right one." "Tell me." She told him. The plan was simple. She would write that afternoon to Mrs. Hyatt of Brockley Lane, if she was still living, to the daughters of the carpenter Calloway and of the cooper Whitfield, and to the boatswain Reed's widow, who kept a small dame's school near the dockyard. She would ask each whether, of their own free will, they would consent to swear a deposition before a magistrate that, in the autumn of 15, they had received bread, tea, and small coin from a young woman in a dark cloak who had given no name, and that they had since learned that woman's name to be Cora Linwood. She would ask none of them to swear to anything they did not know, only, if they wished, to set their hands to a paper which said the truth. If even 3 of them agreed, she said, the petition would collapse. Halloran could not, before any magistrate, sustain the charge of clandestine disbursement of funds suggestive of unsuitable disposition for the office of trustee, in the face of 3 respectable women swearing they had received that disbursement and considered it a kindness. Edmund considered. He said, "It will be in the papers." "Yes. You will not be able to undo it. You will, henceforward, be the Duchess who fed the widows of Portsmouth. It will be told and retold. It will cease to be your private secret." "Yes. You have, for 10 years, kept it as your private secret." "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him a long moment. She said, "Because I had nothing else of my own. The bread was small, the coin was small, the cloak was second-hand. But the choice was mine, and the going down to the quayside in the fog was mine, and the not being thanked was mine. It was the one thing my stepfather had not yet taken from me, because he did not know it existed. To keep it secret was to keep it mine. And to give it up now will be—" She paused, and chose the word again with the same deliberate care. "Will be to give it up to you. To me. To you. To this house. To this name. To the court and the papers and Mrs. Pell and Tomlin and the kitchen maids and Mr. Petherton and the bishop and the elderly cousins. To everyone who has, since yesterday, the right to know who the new Duchess is. I am—" She pressed her hand on the petition briefly and lifted it. "I am ready to give it up. I had not, until yesterday afternoon in the sitting room upstairs, known that I was ready. I am ready now. I am very tired of holding it alone." He came round the desk. He took her hands. Her hands were cold. Her grip was steady. He said, "Then we shall write the letters together. Today. Today. Now. I have a clerk who can carry them by the evening coach. They will be in Portsmouth by morning." She said his name once, quietly, as if to test whether the room could hold it. She told him her stepfather would fight it, and that he would fight it ugly. He answered, with the same level steadiness she had used at the petition, that they would not flinch. "I should like—"
I should like, Your Grace, to have on this desk, while we write the letters, the candle from the upstairs sitting room. I should like it lit.
I am sentimental about the candle. He rang the bell and asked Mrs. Pell to bring the candle. Mrs. Pell did not raise her eyebrows. The candle was brought, in its plain pewter holder, with a fresh wick. Edmund lit it. The flame stood up steady on the green leather desk between them, and they sat down on either side of it, and they wrote the letters. They wrote 4 letters between them, in the slow, careful hand of people who knew every sentence would be read aloud in a courtroom. Cora wrote 3. Edmund wrote 1, a covering note to Mrs. Hyatt, vouching for the bearer of the sealed enclosed, asking her, if willing, to receive the Duchess within the week. Cora's hand was very different from his, small, dense, leaning slightly forward, and Edmund found himself watching the way she held the pen, her left hand bracing the page. She had a way of pressing on a thing she meant to make sure of. He thought he should like, in the years that came, to be one of the things she pressed her thumb on. The letters went out by the 4 o'clock coach. The clerk Edmund had spoken of carried them himself. He was a thin, attentive young man named Dewson, who had served the Marchwood solicitors for 6 years, and had, on receiving his orders, said only, "Yes, Your Grace," and "Yes, Your Grace," twice, and gone away. By morning he was at Mrs. Hyatt's bakery in Brockley Lane. That evening, Sunday, Edmund and Cora dined alone at the small round table that had been set for them in the Duchess's sitting room, rather than at the long table in the salon. Mrs. Pell had perceived, with the discreet competence which had earned her a place above the housekeepers of 3 larger houses, that the Duke and Duchess were, that night, neither in a mood for 60 places, nor in a mood to be observed by the lower hall, and had arranged the small table without being asked. The candle from the desk had been brought up. It stood between them on a clean linen cloth. The fire in the grate was small and quiet, and the curtains had been drawn against the spring evening cold. They did not, that night, speak much of Mr. Halloran. They had spoken of him at length all afternoon. Instead, Cora asked, over the soup, about Edmund's father, who had been lost 3 years ago. Edmund, who had not, since the funeral, spoken of him to anyone but his uncle, found himself describing, in the slow, halting voice of a man unused to it, the man who had taught him to ride at 6 and to read parliamentary papers at 12. He told her of his father's habit of reading aloud to his mother in the long winter evenings, and of his small, rough hands, which had been the hands of a man who had been a midshipman at 13. She set down her spoon. She said, "He was in the Navy. For 4 years. He left when his elder brother was lost. He inherited the title at 16. He did not, again, set foot on a deck of any kind. He spoke of it sometimes, in the evenings, the way a man speaks of a country he was happy in for a year and never returned to. My father was at the Glorious first. I know. He was a captain at 28, a happy man. I do not remember him well. I was 8 when he was lost. But I remember he was happy. My mother..." She paused, the small line between her brows reappearing. "Married for love, against her family. When he was lost, she had no one. She married Mr. Halloran in the 2nd autumn after, because the Linwood estate had been entailed and sold, and the trust my grandfather left was held in Bath by Mr. Halloran on her behalf. He had made himself indispensable. She was very tired. She married him to be allowed to stop thinking. She survived 4 years, then succumbed to an inflammation of the lungs, properly, in her bed, with my hand in hers. I was 15. After that, I went to my aunt's at Linwood Cross, and to Portsmouth at 15, and to Portsmouth at 15. I had a small allowance from my mother's trust, which my stepfather, at that point, did not yet know how to redirect. I used it. I went down to the quayside 3 nights a week. I am not, you must understand, a person who has done a great many courageous things in her life. I have done one. I have done it without telling anyone. I have, since this morning, the strangest and most unexpected feeling, which is that it has been received. It has been received. By you. And by me. I had not. She set her spoon down, and pressed her fingertips together, and looked at the candle between them. I had not understood that I wanted it to be received. I had thought it was finished. The widows are now elderly or have moved. The carpenter's daughter is married to a clerk in the Navy office, the cooper's widow. I have not had word of her in 8 years, but Dewson will find her, I trust. I had thought that the small thing I did was a finished thing. I see now it has been, all this time, waiting to be told. Edmund, I am very strange tonight. Forgive me. I do not yet know how to be a person who has been seen. You will learn. I shall need a little practice. You shall have it. We have, I am told, 50 years. She smiled then, very slightly. The second smile he had seen on her face. She picked up her spoon. They finished the soup. The replies came through the week, by the fast coaches, one by one. Mrs. Hyatt of Brockley Lane was alive. She was 68. She had received Mr. Dewson on Monday morning, and had sat down with him at her own kitchen table and dictated a deposition in her own words, which she had then signed with a steady hand. The carpenter's daughter, Mrs. Henrietta Calloway Brent, who was now 29 and married, agreed to swear. She remembered the cloak, and the basket, and the bread. She remembered, she wrote, the lady's hand at our door, which was thin, and which I held for a half-second once when she pressed the bread on me, and which was the warmest hand I had felt in our house in 3 months. The cooper's widow, Mrs. Whitfield, was found by Dewson at the dame's school the boatswain Reed's widow now kept, where she had gone to live on retiring. She dictated a deposition longer than any of the others, in which she said, in her own way, that the lady in the cloak had saved the lives of her 3 children in November of 15, by preventing her from doing the thing she had been preparing herself in the dark of that month to do, which she now thought of as the small private thing she would never tell her grandchildren, but would tell, if anyone asked her in court, with a steady voice. She signed her deposition with her full name, and below it she wrote, with thanks. The boatswain Reed's widow, Mrs. Reed, signed too, with a small note in the margin saying that she had wept when Mr. Dewson had given her the Duke's covering letter, and that she had not slept the night between his visit and her signing. Mr. Dewson was back in London by Friday morning, with all 4 sealed depositions and a small basket of seed cakes which Mrs. Hyatt had pressed upon him for the Duchess. The seed cakes were brought up to the morning room. Cora opened the basket and looked at them, and pressed both hands over her mouth and laughed. Not a sound, only a movement at her shoulders, for a long minute. They are her seed cakes, she said. She used to bake them in 15. The smell. Edmund, the smell of them, in our front hall at noon. She did not finish. She set the basket on the table. She leaned forward and rested her forehead briefly on the back of her own hands. He laid his hand on the back of her neck, where the loose hair had fallen forward, and held it there a moment, and did not speak. The hearing was set for the 2nd Friday. Mr. Halloran's solicitor had asked for an early date, perhaps in the expectation of a duchess unprepared. The Court of Chancery, on this occasion, obliged. The hearing was held in a small panelled room behind the Great Hall, before a single judge in a grey wig, with 2 clerks at the side desks and a public bench at the rear which had filled, by the time the case was called, with several elderly ladies in plumed hats who had, Edmund saw, with a small private dismay, decided that this was the entertainment of the season. Mr. Halloran sat in the front row of the petitioner's bench, in his black coat and his dove waistcoat. He did not, this morning, wear the chain of office to which he had no right. He had been advised, presumably, against it. His solicitor opened the case. He spoke at length, and well, in the polished phrasing of a man who had been pleading before Chancery for 30 years. He laid out the petition. He read aloud the grounds. He emphasized, with a careful, calibrated rhetoric, the words clandestine, irregular, undisclosed, and unfit. He sketched, without quite saying it, the picture of a young woman who had, in the autumn of 15, kept improper company in the dark hours of the evening at Portsmouth, and who, because of that improper company, was unsuited to the office of trustee of any property. He sat down. The judge inclined his head to Edmund's solicitor, Mr. Holt of Lansdowne and Holt, who rose at the respondent's bench. Mr. Holt was a thin, elegant gentleman of 50, whose hair was the same dove grey as Mr. Halloran's waistcoat, and who had, since Tuesday evening, been preparing the case at his desk with a thoroughness which had pleased even his junior clerks. Mr. Holt did not, at first, mention Lieutenant Carrow. He began by reading aloud, in his level, even courtroom voice, the 4 sealed depositions, each in its turn: Mrs. Hyatt's, Mrs. Calloway Brent's, Mrs. Whitfield's, Mrs. Reed's. He read them slowly. He did not editorialize. He read Mrs. Whitfield's deposition entire, including the small sentence in which she said the lady in the cloak had saved the lives of her 3 children, and the room, the row of plumed hats, the clerks at their desks, Mr. Halloran on his bench, went very still. When he had finished, he said, "I have here also, my lord, with the leave of the court, a letter dated April of the year 3 years past, written by Lieutenant James Carrow of His Majesty's ship Pellucid, who is no longer with us, in which the witnessing of the same conduct is set down. I do not propose to read it aloud. The letter is private property. It has been read, since its discovery, only by the Duke and the Duchess. I do not propose to put it into the public record. I would offer it, with the leave of the court, only for inspection by your lordship in chambers, after the public hearing, should your lordship require corroboration." The judge inclined his head. Mr. Holt sat down. Mr. Halloran's solicitor rose again. He understood by now the nature of the case he was opposing. He attempted, with the practiced agility of a long-experienced advocate, to redirect. He argued that the depositions, while moving, did not address the substance of his petition. That the substance of his petition was not the lady's character, but her judgment. That a lady who had, in the autumn of 15, undertaken disbursements of money without record, oversight, or family approval, was a lady who, however benevolent her intentions, did not possess the steady habits of management required of a trustee. He had perhaps prepared this fallback. He had not perhaps anticipated who would respond. The judge, a man with very sharp, pale eyes, which had been studying Cora since she had taken her seat at the petitioner's table, turned to her and said, "Your Grace, have you anything you wish to say to the court?" She rose. She did not, this time, look at Edmund. She did not need to. She had decided, with him at the candle on the desk, what she would say if she were asked. She had, since the morning, been waiting for the question. She said, "My lord, the disbursements of which my stepfather speaks were, in their entirety, made out of an allowance left to me by my mother, the late Lady Linwood, which fell into my own hands at the age of 15 on her death. The allowance was small. The disbursements were small. I have, with the assistance of the Duke and his solicitor, drawn up an account of every shilling so disbursed in the autumn and winter of 15, dated and itemized, which is in this folder, my lord, and which I lay before your lordship now." She walked, in her plain, dark walking dress, to the clerk's table, and laid the folder upon it, and returned to her seat. "The total, my lord, is £23 and 7 shillings, expended over 4 months, in bread, tea, candles, blankets, and small coin, to the 3 widows of seamen who had served under my late father. I had, my lord, a private reason for not wishing it known, which is that I had correctly assessed that my stepfather would, if he learned of it, take steps to prevent it. I do not present this as a virtue. I present it as the explanation of the secrecy. The secrecy was not in the conduct. It was in the absence of opposition to the conduct. I have, since my marriage on Saturday last, no further reason for secrecy, and I am content for the account to stand on the public record. I submit, with respect, that the petition before your lordship is without ground." She sat down. The court was silent for some seconds. The judge took the folder from the clerk. He turned the pages. He turned several pages, slowly. He did not, at first, lift his eyes from them. After a long minute, he said, in a voice which had in it a small, dry undercurrent, which Edmund recognized as the voice of a man amused, "Mr. Halloran." Mr. Halloran rose. His pink had drained out of his cheekbones for the second time in a week. "You are, I believe, the petitioner." "Yes, my lord." "I have read the petition. I have heard the depositions.
I have heard the Duchess. I have here in front of me an account, dated and itemized, of every shilling of disbursement to which the petition objects. The account is meticulous. The hand is the Duchess's own.
The disbursement, by my count, totals £23 and 7 shillings over 4 months in the late year of 15, expended upon bread, tea, blankets, candles, and small coin to the widows of seamen who had served under the Duchess's father. Mr. Halloran, have you anything to add to your petition?
My lord,
Anything at all, sir?
My lord, the conduct was without your approval, sir.
Yes, so it has been said. Have you anything to add of substance?
No, my lord.
Then the petition, the judge said, is dismissed. The Duchess's account will be lodged with the court. The trust, by the marriage settlement of last week, passes jointly to the Duchess and the Duke of Marchwood. Mr. Halloran will pay the costs of this hearing. We shall adjourn. The plumed hats in the public bench released a small, audible sound, which the judge ignored. The clerks rose. The judge rose. The court rose. Mr. Halloran, still on his feet, did not move. Edmund and Cora walked out of the Court of Chancery into the spring afternoon, side by side, without hurry. They did not speak in the corridor. They did not speak on the steps. They went down to the carriage. The footman shut the door. The carriage moved. When they were a half-mile from the court, Cora, who had been looking out of the window at the people on the pavement, and at the spring trees, and at the slow movement of carriages along the Strand, turned in her seat and said, "I have not, since my mother left us, won a single argument with him. I have for 10 years lost every one." I had begun, in my private thoughts, to believe I was incapable of winning. You won this one. We won this one. You did most of the winning. You held the candle. He laughed. It was a sound he had not, since his father's death, made in the presence of another person. He had laughed, in those years, only once or twice, and quietly, alone, at things he had read. He laughed now, in the carriage, and Cora, who had heard him laugh perhaps 4 short laughs in the 8 days she had known him, turned her grey eyes on him, and her face changed, as it had in the upstairs sitting-room on Saturday afternoon, into the face beneath the face. She leaned forward, slowly, across the small space of the carriage. She set her gloved hand on the lapel of his coat. She did not look away from his eyes. She said, "Edmund." "Yes." "I am going to kiss you, in this carriage, in the middle of the Strand, in the 2nd week of May, in the year 18, before we are 5 minutes from the court. I am giving you fair warning. If you do not wish me to do so, you have 10 seconds in which to say." He did not say. He waited until she leaned the 2nd inch and let his hand find the small of her back, and his other hand the side of her face, and he kissed her, once, slowly, with the complete attention of a man who had spent 12 days learning the geography of her face on horseback, and meant to use what he had learned. She did not, at first, kiss him back. She was very still, the way she had been still in the church, with the steadiness of a person who had decided not to flinch. After a long moment, however, she did kiss him back, and her hand on his lapel pressed in the way her thumb had pressed against the prayer book leather in the church, slowly, deliberately, until she meant it. The carriage rattled. The footman on the box did not turn. The horses kept their pace. London rolled past the window, indifferent. When she drew back, at last, she did not draw back far. She put her forehead against his. She said, I had not meant to do that until much later in the year. Forgive me. The judgment in the court, and the candle on the desk on Sunday, and the heron at the river gate yesterday morning, and you laughing in the carriage just now, I have, you understand, been holding myself for some time. I had not realized I was about to stop. Do not apologize. I am not apologizing. I am informing you. Ah. Edmund. Yes.
There is a thing I have been meaning to say to you since Saturday afternoon, and I had thought I should not say it for some weeks yet. I find, in the carriage, in the middle of the Strand, in the second week of May, that I do not see why I should wait. May I say it now? Yes. I love you, she said, very simply. I do not mean it as a duchess saying it to a duke. I do not mean it as a wife being polite to a husband. I mean it as a woman who has been, since 1 o'clock on Saturday afternoon when you knelt on the wrong side of the room, feeling the slow, steady warmth of a candle in a window for the first time in her life. I mean it as the woman who walked the quayside in the cloak, from the place where I have not, in 25 years, ever spoken from. I love you. I had to say it before we got to the gates of the house, because once we are inside, I shall again become very correct, and shall not, in correctness, manage to say it for some days. He did not, for a moment, speak. He could not. His throat had done a thing it had not done since his father's funeral. He breathed once, twice, very carefully, and then he answered her, because she had said it first, and the rule of the carriage was that the second answer must match the first. I love you, he said. Cora. I had not, until you said it just now, known the words were sitting under my collarbone. It was sitting there since the moment I read the second page of the letter at the desk in the study at 7:30 on Saturday morning. They'd been sitting there for 8 days. I had not known how to put them out. You have put them out. I love you. From there, from the bottom, from the place where the letter said the candle was. She did not, this time, kiss him. She pressed her forehead against his again, and did not move, for the rest of the long way back to Cavendish Square. The candle of the carriage lamp swayed, very gently, against the velvet ceiling, and the footman, discreet, motionless, kept the horses to a steady walk, and they were, as she had promised, again very correct by the time the front door of Marchwood House came into view. They went to Portsmouth in the third week of May. The travelling carriage was the dark blue one that had not been out of the coach-house since Edmund's father's last journey 4 years ago. He had had it repainted on the panels on Tuesday, and Tomlin had brushed and oiled the cushions on Wednesday, and on Thursday morning at 6, the carriage stood in the square at the foot of the front steps with the 4 greys harnessed, and Mr. Dewson on the box beside the coachman as guide. Mrs. Hyatt's bakery in Brockley Lane was a low building of soft red brick, with a single white-painted door, a small bow window beside it, and an iron bracket above the door from which an old painted sign, a sheaf of wheat, a candle, and the word Hyatt, swung very slightly in the morning breeze. The carriage drew up at the corner. Edmund handed Cora down. They walked the last 20 paces along the lane. Mrs. Hyatt had been told the Duchess would call. Mrs. Hyatt had been told to expect the carriage between 10 and 11. Mrs. Hyatt had baked, that morning, 3 tins of seed cakes and a small loaf of brown bread, which she had wrapped in a clean white cloth, and she stood now at the open door, in her best dark grey gown, with her white linen cap freshly pressed, and her hands folded in front of her apron, in the careful posture of a woman who has been a tradeswoman all her life, and knows exactly how to receive a duchess. She did not kneel. She did not curtsy deeply. She inclined her head. She said, "Your Grace." Cora had crossed the threshold of Mrs. Hyatt's bakery exactly 3 times before in her life, in the autumn of 15, to buy a small brown loaf at the morning counter. Mrs. Hyatt had served her each time without speaking, and had never afterward, in the public street, given any sign of recognition. Cora had taken this for indifference. She had been wrong. She had been wrong about a great many things in the autumn of 15, and in the 8 years since, and in the 8 days since her wedding. She had decided, on the carriage from the Court of Chancery, that she was prepared to keep being wrong in this direction for the rest of her life. She did not, at the door, perform the Duchess. She crossed the threshold. She looked at Mrs. Hyatt. She said, "Mrs. Hyatt, I have come to thank you." "Your Grace need not." "Your Grace must." She put out her hands. Mrs. Hyatt, who had not, in the Duchess's assessment, expected to be touched, looked down at the offered hands, and looked up at the Duchess's face,
and put out her own hands, and Cora took them, and held them, and pressed them once, as her thumb had pressed in the church, and on the petition, and on the desk on Sunday, and let them go. "For 10 years, Cora said, I thought of your candle in the window when I was in low spirits. I thought of it in winter at Linwood Cross, when it was very dark in my room. And I thought of it on the days I had to take coffee with my stepfather. And I thought of it on Saturday morning when I was dressing for the church. I had never had occasion to thank you for it. I have come now." Mrs. Hyatt did not immediately speak. Her eyes, small, dark, very awake, went from Cora's face to Edmund's behind her, and back, and she said in the quiet voice of a woman who has lived 68 years without crying in public, "I knew you, Your Grace. The first night you came to the carpenter's door, I followed you to the corner of Brockley Lane to see that you got safely back to the lodging house. I followed you twice more in October. I did not speak. I lit the candle in the window because the cobbles at the corner of Calloway's were uneven, and a foot might miss them, and I did not wish a foot to miss them. That is all." The candle was a small thing. It was not a small thing, Cora said. It was a thing she could do, Mrs. Hyatt answered. They held that exchange between them for a moment, the Duchess and the baker's widow, like two women settling a small, old debt that had stood unaccounted for 10 years, and had been waiting only for the chance to be set straight. "There was a young officer," Mrs. Hyatt said, "who lodged in the room above the kitchen in the months you were coming. He was much taken with you, Your Grace, in the silent way young men are taken with women they have decided not to disturb. He asked me once, after you had gone, who you were. I told him I did not know. I had decided, you understand, that what was yours, and that no name of yours was mine to give. He went away to the Pellucid in the spring, and was lost off Spartel in the autumn following. I did not learn until last week that he had set down what he saw. He set it down for me. Yes." Cora thanked her then, in the simplest possible words, both for the silence she had kept about the name, and for the candle she had set in the window. Mrs. Hyatt said, again, that the candle had been a small thing. It had been, Cora answered, the largest thing in her life. Mrs. Hyatt did not speak for a long second. She inclined her head. She turned, carefully, and lifted from the counter behind her the small loaf of brown bread wrapped in the clean white cloth, and gave it to the Duchess with both hands, and Cora took it with both hands, and turned to Edmund, and gave it into his keeping. And Edmund, who had been standing at the threshold with his hat in his hand and saying nothing, bowed to Mrs. Hyatt, and tucked the loaf, very carefully, into the crook of his elbow, as though it were the most important parcel he had ever carried out of any door in his life. They went on to the houses of Mrs. Calloway Brent, and Mrs. Whitfield, and Mrs. Reed. They sat at 4 kitchen tables. They drank 4 cups of tea. They were thanked, and they thanked. And Cora, who had not, by her own account, sat with any of these women in person before, left each kitchen with a small, specific physical detail to keep. The brass clock on the carpenter's daughter's mantel, the painted shell on the cooper's widow's windowsill, the small carved horse on the chimney-piece at the dame school which the boatswain Reed had whittled for his eldest son. The carved horse was perhaps 3 inches high. It had a chip out of one ear. Its mane had been incised with the point of a small carving tool in the way that sailors carved. Cora stood for some seconds in front of the carved horse. She set her hand on the chimney-piece beside it. She did not pick it up. She turned to Mrs. Reed and said, "May I ask, has your eldest son a smaller brother, who would, perhaps, accept a horse of his own were one to be sent down?" Mrs. Reed looked at the carved horse. She looked at the Duchess. She said, "He has, Your Grace, a brother of 9. He is a great deal like his eldest brother. He would be much pleased. Then a horse of his own shall be sent down. I had a brother also, who was a great deal like his eldest brother. He too—" She paused for a half-second. Her hand pressed once on the chimney-piece and lifted.
He, too, was much pleased by carved horses.
We shall send a horse down by Friday. A horse was sent down by Friday. Edmund commissioned it from a woodcarver in Soho whom his father had once employed for a chess set. The carver, given a sketch and a free hand and a generous fee, produced a small chestnut horse of 3 inches with its mane incised by carving tool and a chip, placed deliberately by Cora, out of one ear. The horse was packed in a wooden box with a small letter from the Duchess. It went down on the morning coach. Mrs. Reed's reply, 4 days later, said only that her younger son had taken the horse to bed with him on the first night and to school with him on the second, and that he had named it, after some thought, Pellucid, because the Duchess had said in her letter that she had once known a sailor on a ship of that name. The summer came. The household learned, in the slow way households learn, that the new Duchess preferred the morning room to the formal salon, was at her desk by 7, rode out at sunrise in a dark bronze cloak, and cared greatly for the small charity board she had quietly assumed at the Royal Hospital at Greenwich. They learned, too, that the Duke had taken to bringing his correspondence into the morning room while she wrote, and laying his parliamentary papers on the round table by the fire. Mrs. Pell had not, in 11 years, been asked to set out 2 cups for breakfast there. She set out 2 cups now. The kitchen maid, Eliza, upon being told, sat down on a stool and laughed for a full minute before resuming her peas. In June, they went to Hertfordshire. The housekeeper of the country house, who had not seen the Duke in 4 years, did not weep when she opened the door. But it was, the under-housemaid said in the back kitchen afterwards, very nearly. Cora walked out with Edmund along the Chestnut Avenue and along the river path and along the long ride up to the chalk ridge, and she said, on the 3rd afternoon, that she had not, since the summer she was 9, lived in a place where the morning began with the smell of mown grass. They stayed 5 weeks. They'd been expected to stay 2. In October, a particular October morning, fine, with a thin frost on the inside of the carriage glass, and the chestnut leaves yellow on the avenue, Edmund went into his study at 7:30 to read a letter from his solicitor. He was 28 years of age now, and a duke, and a married man of 5 months and 9 days, and he had not, since the morning of his wedding, opened a letter without looking first at the cover. The letter on the green leather blotter that morning was from Lansdowne and Holt. It concerned a rural matter of no great importance. He read it, signed the response, and pushed it aside. He looked then at the small framed page above the desk, the 4th and last page of Lieutenant Carrow's letter, which Cora had asked, in July, that he have framed in plain dark wood and hung where he would see it each morning. The other 3 pages were in a small lacquered box on her own desk in the morning room. She had asked that he keep what was for him, the page in which the lieutenant had declared, in plain words, that he wrote the letter not to be answered, but to be received, and that she keep what was for her. He had agreed. He read the framed page. He read it most mornings. He had been reading it that morning when the door opened and Cora came in her morning dress, with her hair down her back in a single plait, the colour of beechwood, with a small carved chestnut horse in her hand. She set the horse down on the desk beside the inkwell. "There," she said. "I have decided where he lives." "Pellucid?" "Pellucid. He has been on the morning room mantel for 3 months. I find him too far from me there. He shall live here, where I shall come in to see him each morning, and where you shall watch him while you sign your papers. He is very welcome." "Edmund?" "Yes." She told him it was the 8th of October. He nodded. He knew the date. "It is... I have not, until this morning, been certain. I am certain now. I should like to tell you. I do not yet wish to tell anyone else. I have not yet told Mrs. Pell. I have told you first, because you knelt on the wrong side of the chair on the afternoon of our wedding day, and I had decided, between then and now, that you shall always be the first one I tell anything." He had risen, by this time, from his chair behind the desk. He did not, this morning, ask what she had to tell him. He did not need to. He had seen, in her face, in the last fortnight, the small interior change which a man who has watched a woman's face for 5 months learns to read. And he had held himself against asking until she should be ready to say. He came round the desk. He stood in front of her. He did not touch her. He waited. She said, very simply, "In the spring. Probably in April. The doctor came on Tuesday. He says everything is well." He did not immediately answer in words. He set his hand on the side of her face, very lightly, and bent his forehead to hers, and stood there a long moment with his eyes closed, and he did the small, slow breathing he had done in the carriage on the Strand, and he steadied himself. After a long moment he said, "Then we shall light a candle on the desk this evening. We shall put it in the window. There is no one who needs to find their way to our door, I do not think, this evening. But we shall light the candle." "Yes." "Cora." "Yes." "I love you." "I know." "I should like to say it more often, in the years that come, than I have managed in the months that have passed. I am a man who has only recently learned to say it. I shall require practice. I am asking your patience while I get the practice." She lifted her face. She put her hand against his cheek. She said, "By the autumn, I told you. By the autumn, you would hear it more than once. We are at the autumn, Your Grace. Begin practicing." He laughed, for the second time ever in the presence of another person, and he held her, in the study at Marchwood House, with the small carved horse on the desk, and the framed page above it, and the cold morning light falling in through the long window. And he thought of the cold grate at 7:30 on the morning of his wedding, and of the green wax seal, which he had broken without reading the cover, and of a candle in a bakery window on a foggy night in the autumn of 15, which had, in some way he did not quite understand, lit, in the end, his own door. That evening, in the Duchess's sitting room upstairs, Cora set the small pewter candle holder on the deep sill of the long window. She fitted a fresh white candle into it. She lit the wick from a taper. She drew back, and stood beside Edmund, and looked at the candle, and said, in the lower voice that came from further down in the chest, "There, for anyone who is walking in fog this evening, they shall find the steps." He drew her in against his side. He laid his cheek briefly against her hair. The candle burned steadily. The window stood open to the autumn night. Below in Cavendish Square, a carriage passed, and another, and the lamps of the square came up one by one along the iron railings. It was a very quiet evening. The candle did not gutter. It would, the housekeeper would note in her diary the next morning, burn through to nearly 4 o'clock without going out. And that, dear listener, is the end of the story of the Duke who opened the wrong letter on his wedding morning, and the Duchess who, by 3:30 on her wedding afternoon, had decided that the man who had broken her seal was the only man she had ever wished to keep on her threshold. If you have liked the telling, draw your chair closer to the fire next time and stay a while. There is always another story coming.